November 8, 1962. I Course, South Vietnam. The after-action report would never capture what American commanders witnessed in the jungle that morning. An Australian SAS patrol, just 10 men, had vanished into dense canopy where visibility dropped to 15 feet. No helicopters, no artillery support, no search and destroy convoy cutting through the undergrowth like a bulldozer. For 7 hours, they moved 12 kilometers through terrain that swallowed sound and swallowed men. Radio silence. Perfect discipline. When they emerged, the enemy supply cache was destroyed, intelligence gathered, and not a single casualty. Meanwhile, American forces, with their Huey helicopters, advanced weaponry, and overwhelming firepower, were taking heavy losses in the same jungle. US Army leadership dismissed the Australian methods as small-time operations that couldn't scale to real warfare. The jungle belonged to technology and superior numbers, they believed. The Australians were operating with something the Americans had forgotten how to use: patience, stealth, the ability to become invisible in terrain that turned every American advantage into a liability. But in the green hell of Vietnam, the most decisive factor in survival wasn't firepower or technology. It was learning to fight like ghosts in a war where being loud meant being dead. Subscribe for more untold war stories. Major Jim O'Neill squinted through the humid morning air as he watched the 10-man Australian SAS patrol disappear into the jungle wall like smoke dissolving into green darkness. The temperature had already climbed to 85 degrees Fahrenheit at 0700 hours, and the humidity made his uniform stick to his skin like wet canvas. Behind him, the rotors of 3 UH-1 Huey helicopters churned the air into a thunderous whirlwind, drowning out the subtle sounds of the Vietnamese jungle that stretched endlessly in all directions. "Those Aussies think they're playing hide-and-seek," Colonel Marcus Webb shouted over the rotor noise, adjusting his flak jacket. Webb commanded the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Division, and had arrived in Vietnam 6 months earlier with absolute confidence in American military superiority. 10 men with small packs and pop guns. We'll show them how real warfare works. O'Neill nodded, though something gnawed at him as he watched the last Australian soldier, Captain Charles Bell, pause at the jungle's edge. Bell moved with a fluid economy of motion that seemed almost rehearsed, checking his compass without breaking stride, then vanishing into the undergrowth without disturbing a single branch. The silence that followed felt unnatural after the mechanical roar of American equipment. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Webb's search and destroy mission involved 60 American soldiers, 3 helicopters, 2 jeeps loaded with communications equipment, and enough firepower to level a city block. The plan was simple and overwhelming: insert the force via helicopter, sweep through a suspected Viet Cong staging area in grid squares Tango 7 through Tango 9, destroy any enemy installations, and extract before nightfall. Maximum pressure, minimum subtlety. "Australians have been here since '62 with their army training team," Webb continued, consulting a tactical map spread across the hood of his command jeep. 2 years of playing games in the jungle while we've been building the real military infrastructure. They don't understand the scale of operations required to win this war." O'Neill studied the terrain through his binoculars. The jungle canopy rose nearly 100 feet above the forest floor, creating a twilight world even in broad daylight. Visibility dropped to 15 feet in most directions, and the undergrowth was so dense that moving in formation would require cutting through vegetation with machetes. Every step would announce their presence to anyone listening. The Australians had simply melted into that green maze like it was their natural habitat. The helicopter insertion went exactly as planned. Webb's force landed in a cleared area roughly 2 kilometers from their target zone and immediately established a defensive perimeter. Radio chatter filled the airwaves as squad leaders reported their positions and confirmed communications links. The sound of 60 men moving through dense jungle was like a freight train crashing through a cathedral. "Contact front!" The radio crackled with urgent voices 20 minutes into the patrol. "Taking fire from concealed positions. Request immediate artillery support." O'Neill monitored the developing firefight from the command post, watching red symbols multiply on the tactical display as enemy positions were identified. The Viet Cong had anticipated the American approach route and prepared a textbook L-shaped ambush. Automatic weapons fire erupted from hidden bunkers, while mortars began dropping into the American formation with deadly accuracy. Webb called in artillery strikes within minutes, and the jungle erupted in geysers of earth and shredded vegetation. The 105mm howitzers stationed at Firebase Charlie responded with devastating firepower, dropping high-explosive rounds in a pattern designed to suppress enemy positions. Helicopter gunships arrived 30 minutes later, their door-mounted M60 machine guns spraying 7.62mm rounds into suspected enemy locations. The firefight lasted 4 hours and consumed enough ammunition to supply a small army. When the smoke cleared, Webb's force had killed an estimated 15 Viet Cong fighters and destroyed 3 bunkers, but had suffered 8 wounded and 2 killed in action. More troubling, the enemy had withdrawn before the artillery could achieve maximum effect, disappearing into tunnel systems that honeycombed the jungle floor. Classic American victory, Webb announced during the after-action briefing, pointing to casualty figures on a chalkboard. Superior firepower and technology overcome guerrilla tactics every time. The enemy learned they can't stand toe-to-toe with professional soldiers. O'Neill wasn't convinced. The Viet Cong had chosen the engagement location, controlled the timing, and withdrawn at will. American technology had certainly made noise and destroyed vegetation, but the enemy had achieved their objective, bleeding American forces while preserving their own strength for future operations. The Australian patrol returned that evening without a sound. O'Neill only knew they had arrived when Captain Bell appeared at the command post, like a ghost materializing from the darkness. His uniform was barely damp with perspiration, despite 12 hours in 100-degree heat and crushing humidity. His equipment showed no signs of the violent struggle through dense undergrowth that had marked the American mission. "Intelligence package," Bell said quietly, handing O'Neill a waterproof pouch containing photographs, documents, and detailed notes. Viet Cong supply cache located at grid reference uniform 47628, 43 weapons, 2,000 rounds of ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment. Also intercepted radio traffic indicating planned attacks on Highway 1 next week. O'Neill examined the materials with growing amazement. The photographs showed a sophisticated underground storage facility that had been completely hidden from aerial reconnaissance. The documents, captured without alerting the enemy to their compromise, detailed Viet Cong operations throughout the region. Most impressive was the precision of the intelligence, exact numbers, specific locations, and tactical plans that would allow American forces to disrupt enemy operations before they began. "How many casualties?" Webb asked, approaching the Australian captain with skeptical interest. "None," Bell replied. "We observed the target for 6 hours, documented everything, and withdrew without enemy contact. They never knew we were there." Webb's expression shifted from skepticism to irritation. "You observed. What about destroying the cache? What about engaging the enemy?" Bell's response was measured and professional. Destroying the cache would have alerted every Viet Cong unit in the province that their security had been compromised. They would have changed their procedures, relocated their operations, and become much harder to track. Instead, we now know exactly where they keep their supplies, when they resupply, and what routes they use. Your forces can intercept their operations systematically, rather than stumbling into prepared ambushes. O'Neill found himself caught between 2 completely different philosophies of warfare. The American approach emphasized decisive engagement and overwhelming force application. Find the enemy, fix him in place, and destroy him with superior firepower. It was the doctrine that had won World War II and built the most powerful military in human history. The Australian approach seemed almost passive by comparison. Avoid contact, gather intelligence, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. It required patience that felt uncomfortably close to inaction, and relied on skills that weren't taught in American military schools. As Webb dismissed the Australian report and began planning another search and destroy operation for the following week, O'Neill studied the photographs from Bell's intelligence package. Somewhere in that green hell, an entirely different war was being fought with rules that the United States Army had never bothered to learn. The Jungle Warfare Training Center at Nui Dat sprawled across 50 acres of carefully preserved Vietnamese terrain, designed to replicate every conceivable combat environment from triple canopy forests to rice paddies and village complexes. Major O'Neill arrived in March of 1965 with the first group of American students, 12 hand-picked soldiers from the 5th Special Forces Group, who had volunteered for what their commanders euphemistically called enhanced tactical training. Sergeant First Class Robert Hudson emerged from the transport helicopter with the skeptical expression of a professional soldier who had seen too many training programs promise revolutionary improvements. Hudson had survived 3 tours in conventional infantry units and earned his Special Forces qualification through sheer determination rather than academic brilliance. His weathered face and methodical movements spoke of someone who trusted experience over theory. "Looks like summer camp," Hudson muttered, adjusting his rucksack as he surveyed the Australian training facilities. The structures were deliberately primitive: bamboo huts, canvas shelters, and equipment caches that could have been mistaken for abandoned outposts. Everything appeared designed to blend into the surrounding jungle rather than dominate it. Captain Bell approached the American group with the quiet confidence that O'Neill had observed during their first encounter. Behind him walked 3 Australian instructors whose uniforms showed the kind of wear that came from years of field operations rather than garrison duty. Their equipment was minimal but meticulously maintained, every piece chosen for function rather than appearance. "Gentlemen, welcome to the most dangerous classroom in Southeast Asia," Bell began, his voice carrying easily across the group without requiring the volume that most military instructors employed. "For the next 4 weeks, you'll learn to survive in terrain that has killed more experienced soldiers than enemy bullets. The jungle doesn't care about your rank, your equipment, or your confidence. It only respects preparation and discipline." The first lesson began before dawn with a navigation exercise that would have been simple on any American military base. Bell provided each student with a compass, a map marked with grid coordinates, and instructions to locate a cache hidden 3 kilometers away in dense jungle. The Americans, accustomed to GPS systems and detailed terrain analysis, approached the problem with mechanical precision. Hudson's team moved out in standard formation, maintaining proper intervals and communication procedures as they pushed through the undergrowth. Within 30 minutes, they were lost. The jungle canopy blocked satellite signals, making their sophisticated navigation equipment useless. Landmarks that appeared clearly marked on their maps were invisible beneath layers of vegetation that seemed to shift and change with every step. "Sound discipline," Bell whispered as he materialized beside O'Neill's struggling patrol 4 hours into the exercise. The Americans had been thrashing through the jungle like a mechanized unit, cutting trails with machetes and communicating through hand signals that were meaningless in limited visibility. "Every broken branch announces your position. Every unnecessary sound travels farther than you think." The Australian instructor demonstrated movement techniques that seemed almost supernatural to soldiers trained in conventional tactics. Bell stepped between trees without disturbing leaves, placed his feet on solid ground that made no noise, and navigated by reading subtle environmental cues that the Americans had never learned to recognize. He moved through jungle terrain at the same speed as the struggling American patrol while maintaining complete silence and leaving virtually no trace of his passage. 12 men moving through jungle should sound like wind through leaves, Bell explained during the afternoon critique session. "Your enemy has been living in this environment since childhood. They can identify American patrols from a kilometer away just by listening to the sounds you make." The revelation was humbling for soldiers who prided themselves on tactical expertise. Hudson, who had considered himself an expert in fieldcraft, realized that his skills were adapted for European terrain and conventional warfare. The Vietnam jungle required completely different techniques, from the way soldiers distributed their weight while walking to the methods they used for camouflage and concealment. Ambush training proved even more challenging. The Americans approached the problem with standard doctrine: identify likely enemy approaches, establish overlapping fields of fire, and engage targets with maximum firepower at optimal range. Bell's instructors demonstrated a completely different philosophy that emphasized patience, precision, and psychological warfare. American ambushes announced themselves with the first shot, explained Sergeant Major Trevor Walsh, a veteran of Malayan operations who had spent 8 years perfecting jungle combat techniques. Every weapon opens fire simultaneously, creating maximum noise and confusion. The enemy knows exactly where you are and can respond accordingly. Walsh's alternative approach seemed almost timid by American standards. SAS ambushes began with a single, precisely aimed shot that eliminated the enemy leader or key personnel. The remaining enemy soldiers, confused and leaderless, would often surrender or flee rather than mounting organized resistance. When follow-up shots were necessary, they came from different positions, creating the impression of a much larger force while maintaining tactical flexibility. The Americans struggled with the discipline required for such tactics. Hudson's natural instinct was to overwhelm problems with superior firepower, the approach that had served him well in previous conflicts. Learning to wait, to observe, and to strike with surgical precision felt uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. "What happens when they don't run?" Hudson asked during a practical exercise where his team had spent 6 hours in position waiting for a simulated enemy patrol. "What happens when they're better disciplined than you expect?" Walsh's answer came in the form of a demonstration that left the American students speechless. Moving through terrain that offered no apparent concealment, the Australian instructor positioned himself within 15 meters of Hudson's carefully prepared ambush site without being detected. From that position, he could have eliminated the entire American team before they realized they were under attack. "The jungle is your ally if you understand it," Walsh explained after revealing his position. "Every tree, every shadow, every sound can provide tactical advantage, but only if you stop trying to dominate the environment and learn to become part of it." The training intensified with exercises in long-range reconnaissance patrol techniques that pushed American conventional thinking to its limits. Teams of 6 soldiers learned to operate independently for weeks at a time, moving through enemy-controlled territory while gathering intelligence and avoiding detection. The psychological pressure was as challenging as the physical demands. O'Neill found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about military effectiveness that had shaped his entire career. American doctrine emphasized speed, overwhelming force, and technological superiority. The Australian approach required patience, stealth, and intimate knowledge of local conditions. Both had proven successful in different contexts, but Vietnam's unique environment seemed to favor the more subtle approach. The breaking point came during a final exercise designed to test everything the Americans had learned. Hudson's team, operating under realistic conditions in dense jungle, spent 3 days stalking a simulated enemy position. Their mission required gathering detailed intelligence while remaining undetected, then withdrawing without leaving evidence of their presence. The Americans failed catastrophically. Despite weeks of intensive training, they were detected within hours of beginning their approach. Their movement techniques, while vastly improved, still generated enough noise to alert experienced enemy forces. Their camouflage, adequate for European forests, was insufficient for Vietnamese jungle conditions. Most critically, their mindset remained focused on eventual engagement rather than pure reconnaissance. Bell's critique was delivered without criticism, but with the kind of professional honesty that military training demanded. "You're thinking like hunters when you need to think like ghosts. The goal isn't to find and destroy the enemy. The goal is to learn everything about the enemy while remaining completely invisible. That requires a different kind of courage than you've been taught to value." As the training cycle concluded, O'Neill realized that the Australian methods weren't just different. They were specifically adapted to conditions that made American conventional tactics ineffective. The jungle environment neutralized many technological advantages while amplifying the importance of individual skill and unit discipline. Learning to fight effectively in Vietnam would require more than tactical adjustments. It would demand a fundamental transformation in how American forces approached warfare itself. The MACV RECONDO School at Nha Trang opened its doors in October 1966 with a mandate that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier: transform conventional American soldiers into jungle warfare specialists capable of operating behind enemy lines for extended periods. Major O'Neill arrived as the school's deputy commander, bringing hard-won insights from his training with Captain Bell and a growing conviction that American military doctrine required fundamental revision. The facility itself represented a compromise between American institutional requirements and Australian tactical realities. Classroom buildings constructed from standard military specifications sat alongside jungle training areas that replicated the environmental challenges of Vietnamese combat zones. The most significant addition was a 300-kilometer training range that extended deep into terrain controlled by Viet Cong forces, where students would conduct actual reconnaissance missions under live-fire conditions. Sergeant First Class Hudson had volunteered to become one of the school's first instructors, despite reservations about teaching methods he was still struggling to master. His initial class consisted of 24 soldiers drawn from conventional infantry units whose commanders had identified them as potential special operations candidates. Most arrived with the confidence of professional soldiers who had successfully completed standard military training programs. "Forget everything you learned about patrolling," Hudson announced during the first day of instruction, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned these lessons through bitter experience. "Forget about fire and maneuver. Forget about establishing fields of fire. Forget about communicating with your base unit every 30 minutes. For the next 6 weeks, you're going to learn to disappear." The curriculum reflected tactical innovations that had never been formally codified in American military doctrine. Students learned to construct improvised shelters using jungle materials that were virtually invisible from distances greater than 5 meters. They practiced moving through dense undergrowth without disturbing vegetation in ways that would reveal their passage hours later. Most challenging of all, they learned to navigate using environmental cues that required intimate knowledge of local conditions. Captain Bell arrived monthly to evaluate student progress and refine training techniques based on operational experience from Australian SAS units operating throughout Southeast Asia. His visits provided opportunities to test American students against instructors who had spent years perfecting these skills in actual combat conditions. Silent communication, Bell demonstrated during a night exercise that pushed students to their psychological limits. Hand signals are useless in jungle conditions where visibility is measured in feet rather than yards. Radio communications can be intercepted and triangulated by enemy forces equipped with direction-finding equipment. You need to anticipate your team members' actions based on shared understanding of tactical principles. The technique required soldiers to think beyond individual survival and consider their patrol as a single organism moving through hostile terrain. Each member needed to understand not only his own responsibilities, but also the capabilities and likely reactions of every other team member. This level of coordination demanded intensive training and absolute trust that few American units had achieved. Hudson watched his students struggle with concepts that contradicted everything they had been taught about military leadership and unit cohesion. American doctrine emphasized clear command structures, explicit orders, and constant communication between subordinates and superiors. The Recondo approach required junior soldiers to make independent tactical decisions based on incomplete information while maintaining coordination with team members who might be hundreds of meters away. The first major test came during a 30-day field exercise conducted in the Central Highlands, where student patrols operated in terrain known to contain active North Vietnamese Army units. Each team received intelligence targets that required penetrating enemy-controlled territory, gathering specific information, and returning without being detected or engaging enemy forces. Hudson's team drew an assignment that seemed almost impossible: locate and photograph a suspected NVA command post somewhere within a 20-square-kilometer area of triple canopy jungle. Intelligence reports suggested the facility was heavily defended and camouflaged to avoid aerial reconnaissance. Previous American patrols had failed to locate the target despite using conventional search patterns and aggressive patrolling techniques. The approach required complete revision of standard operating procedures. Instead of moving directly toward their objective, Hudson's team spent the first week establishing a series of observation posts that allowed them to monitor enemy movement patterns throughout the area. They learned to identify regular patrols, supply routes, and communication procedures without revealing their own presence. Patience is a weapon, Hudson reminded his students as they spent 18 hours motionless in a concealed position, watching North Vietnamese soldiers move supplies along a jungle trail barely 50 meters away. Every hour you wait without being detected increases your tactical advantage. Every bit of information you gather makes the final approach more likely to succeed. The reconnaissance techniques bore little resemblance to American military training. Students learned to read tracks in jungle soil that revealed the size, equipment, and direction of enemy units that had passed days earlier. They practiced identifying camouflage positions by recognizing subtle changes in vegetation patterns that indicated human construction. Most importantly, they developed the mental discipline to observe enemy activity for hours without reacting or revealing their positions. Hudson's team located the NVA command post after 12 days of systematic observation and analysis. The facility was constructed entirely underground, with only carefully concealed ventilation shafts and communication antennas visible from ground level. Access was controlled through a security system that relied on password challenges and scheduled personnel rotations that changed daily. Photographing the installation required infiltrating to within 25 meters of active enemy positions during daylight hours when security was most alert. The approach took 6 hours of careful movement through terrain that offered minimal concealment, with each team member advancing independently while maintaining visual contact with his teammates. The success of the mission validated training techniques that many American commanders had dismissed as impractical for large-scale military operations. Hudson's team returned with detailed photographs, accurate maps, and intelligence about enemy personnel and equipment that proved invaluable for subsequent operations. More significantly, they had accomplished their mission without alerting the enemy to their presence or requiring extraction under fire. Similar successes accumulated throughout 1967 as Recondo graduates applied their training in operational environments across South Vietnam. Casualty rates for units employing these techniques dropped by 25% compared to conventional patrols operating in similar terrain. Intelligence gathering improved dramatically as small teams learned to penetrate enemy-controlled areas that had been inaccessible to larger American forces. The transformation extended beyond tactical techniques to fundamental changes in how American soldiers understood their role in counterinsurgency warfare. Instead of seeking decisive engagements that would destroy enemy forces through superior firepower, Recondo-trained units focused on gathering information that allowed conventional forces to operate more effectively. The approach required different skills, different equipment, and different measures of success than traditional military operations. General William Westmoreland visited the Recondo School in late 1967 to evaluate training programs that were producing results he couldn't ignore. Despite personal reservations about unconventional warfare techniques, Westmoreland recognized that American forces needed every tactical advantage available in a conflict that defied conventional military solutions. These methods work in specific circumstances, Westmoreland acknowledged during his briefing with O'Neill and the school's senior staff. But they cannot replace the decisive engagement and overwhelming force application that wins wars. We cannot defeat the North Vietnamese army by hiding in the jungle and taking photographs. O'Neill understood the institutional resistance that Westmoreland represented, but battlefield results were becoming impossible to dismiss. Recondo-trained units were consistently outperforming conventional forces in intelligence gathering, casualty prevention, and mission success rates. The Australian approach wasn't replacing American military doctrine, but it was filling critical gaps that conventional tactics couldn't address. As 1968 began with the Tet Offensive, demonstrating the limitations of American conventional strategy, the RECONDO School expanded its training programs to include entire units rather than individual soldiers. The jungle warfare techniques that Australian SAS instructors had brought to Vietnam were becoming integrated into standard American Special Operations doctrine, forever changing how the United States military approached conflicts in complex terrain against unconventional enemies. Operation Silent Thunder commenced at 0300 hours on June 15, 1969, when Major O'Neill's combined American-Australian task force infiltrated the Mekong Delta through waterways that had remained under North Vietnamese control since the beginning of American involvement in Vietnam. The mission represented the culmination of 3 years of tactical evolution, bringing together RECONDO-trained American soldiers and Australian SAS veterans in the most ambitious joint operation attempted in the war's most challenging terrain. Captain Bell led the Australian contingent, 8 men whose collective experience included over 40 years of jungle operations in Malaya, Borneo, and Vietnam. Their equipment reflected hard-won lessons about survival in tropical environments: lightweight packs containing only essential items, weapons chosen for reliability rather than firepower, and camouflage patterns specifically designed for Vietnamese vegetation. Each soldier carried enough supplies for 10 days of independent operation, with resupply dependent on pre-positioned caches rather than helicopter delivery. Sergeant First Class Hudson commanded 12 American soldiers drawn from the RECONDO School's most successful graduates, men who had transformed themselves from conventional infantry into specialists capable of extended operations in enemy territory. Their integration with Australian methods had required abandoning much of their original training, replacing American emphasis on overwhelming force with techniques that prioritized stealth and intelligence gathering over direct engagement. The target area encompassed 30 square kilometers of swampland and jungle, where intelligence indicated a major North Vietnamese logistics hub was coordinating supply operations throughout the Mekong Delta. Previous American attempts to locate and destroy this facility had failed, despite massive search and destroy operations involving thousands of soldiers and extensive air support. The enemy had demonstrated remarkable ability to disperse when threatened and reconstitute operations once American forces withdrew. O'Neill studied aerial photographs that revealed nothing useful about enemy positions or activities. The jungle canopy was too dense for meaningful reconnaissance, while the complex waterway system provided unlimited opportunities for concealment and movement. Ground-penetrating radar had identified underground structures, but their military significance remained unclear. The mission would succeed or fail, based on the task force's ability to gather intelligence through direct observation while remaining undetected. The infiltration route followed waterways so narrow that overhanging vegetation created natural tunnels through which the team's small boats moved like shadows. Bell had chosen the approach based on his analysis of enemy patrol patterns and security procedures, identifying gaps in North Vietnamese surveillance that would allow passage without detection. The boats themselves were modified sampans, indistinguishable from civilian craft, powered by electric motors that operated in complete silence. Hudson felt his heart rate increase as they penetrated deeper into territory where any contact with local forces would likely prove fatal. His soldiers had trained for this moment for months, but the reality of operating without support in an environment where the enemy held every advantage tested psychological preparation in ways that no simulation could replicate. Radio contact with their base was impossible due to distance and terrain, leaving the team completely dependent on their own resources. The first objective was a camouflaged observation post that would allow surveillance of the suspected logistics hub without revealing the task force's presence. Bell selected a location in dense swampland where natural vegetation provided concealment while offering sightlines to critical areas. Construction required 6 hours of careful work in complete darkness, using hand tools and natural materials to create a position that would remain invisible even under close inspection. From their concealed position, the combined team observed North Vietnamese operations that exceeded intelligence estimates by an order of magnitude. Instead of a simple supply depot, they discovered a sophisticated logistics complex that processed equipment and personnel for operations throughout South Vietnam. Truck convoys arrived daily, carrying supplies that were transferred to boats for distribution along waterway networks. Personnel rotations suggested a permanent garrison of over 200 soldiers, supported by extensive underground facilities. "This isn't a supply cache," O'Neill whispered to Bell as they documented enemy activities through high-powered telescopes. "This is a major staging area for military operations across the entire region. Taking this out would disrupt enemy capabilities for months." Bell nodded while photographing camouflaged structures that intelligence had never suspected existed. The facility's sophistication indicated years of development and investment that made it strategically valuable far beyond its immediate military function. Destroying it would require precision strikes that eliminated key components while preventing enemy forces from relocating essential equipment and personnel. The surveillance phase extended over 4 days as the task force mapped enemy routines, identified security vulnerabilities, and documented the facility's complete organizational structure. Hudson's soldiers rotated through observation duties while maintaining absolute discipline despite cramped conditions and constant threat of discovery. The psychological pressure was intense, requiring mental toughness that conventional training had never addressed. On the 4th night, Bell identified the opportunity they had been waiting for. Enemy security procedures included a shift change at 0200 hours, when guard posts were temporarily unmanned during personnel rotation. The gap lasted only 12 minutes, but it provided access to communication equipment that could yield intelligence about North Vietnamese operations throughout Southeast Asia. Hudson led the infiltration team, while Bell remained in position to coordinate withdrawal if the mission was compromised. Moving through enemy-controlled territory required every technique learned during months of training, from silent movement through dense vegetation to avoiding detection systems that the North Vietnamese had positioned around critical facilities. The approach took 2 hours to cover 300 meters, with each step carefully planned to avoid creating disturbances that might alert security forces. The communication intercept exceeded all expectations. Hudson's team accessed radio equipment and document archives that revealed North Vietnamese operational plans for major offensives scheduled throughout 1970. The intelligence included troop movements, supply requirements, and tactical objectives that would allow American commanders to anticipate and counter enemy initiatives before they could achieve strategic surprise. Withdrawal proved more challenging than infiltration, as enemy forces had detected signs of intrusion despite the team's precautions. North Vietnamese patrols began systematic searches of areas around the logistics facility, forcing the task force to remain concealed in swampland for 18 hours, while enemy soldiers passed within meters of their position. The psychological stress was overwhelming, requiring discipline that pushed human endurance to its limits. Bell's route planning proved decisive during the extraction phase. Instead of attempting to reach their original infiltration point, he led the team through alternate waterways that avoided enemy search patterns while providing concealment during daylight hours. The journey required 3 days of continuous movement through terrain that challenged even experienced jungle warfare specialists, but the team reached friendly territory without enemy contact. The intelligence gathered during Operation Silent Thunder transformed American understanding of North Vietnamese capabilities and intentions throughout the Mekong Delta. The documents and photographs provided targeting information that enabled subsequent operations to disrupt enemy logistics networks with unprecedented effectiveness. More significantly, the mission demonstrated that combined American-Australian operations could achieve strategic objectives that neither force could accomplish independently. O'Neill's after-action report noted that casualty rates for joint operations were 35% lower than comparable missions conducted by single-nationality units. The combination of Australian tactical expertise and American technological capabilities created synergies that multiplied the effectiveness of both forces while minimizing risks to personnel. The lessons learned would influence special operations doctrine for decades beyond the Vietnam conflict. As 1969 drew to a close, the transformation of American jungle warfare capabilities was complete. Units trained in recondo techniques and integrated with Australian methods were consistently outperforming conventional forces in intelligence gathering, target identification, and mission success rates. The jungle that had once seemed an insurmountable obstacle had become an environment where American soldiers could operate with confidence and tactical advantage. The final American combat troops departed South Vietnam on March 29, 1973, leaving behind a military doctrine that had been fundamentally transformed by 3 years of Australian SAS influence on jungle warfare tactics. Major O'Neill, now promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, supervised the closure of the Recondo School at Nha Trang, while simultaneously documenting training procedures that would become standard curriculum at Fort Bragg and other special operations facilities worldwide. The statistics told a story that military historians would analyze for decades. American units employing SAS-influenced tactics had achieved mission success rates 35% higher than conventional forces, while suffering casualty rates 40% lower than units using traditional search and destroy methods. The transformation hadn't eliminated American technological advantages, but had integrated them with fieldcraft techniques that maximized effectiveness in complex terrain against unconventional enemies. Sergeant First Class Hudson, now a Master Sergeant, had become one of the Army's leading experts on long-range reconnaissance patrol tactics. His experiences training with Captain Bell and subsequent operations throughout Southeast Asia positioned him to influence special operations doctrine for the next generation of American soldiers. The lessons learned in Vietnamese jungles would prove invaluable in conflicts yet to come, from Central America to the Middle East. "We learned to fight their war instead of forcing them to fight ours," Hudson reflected during his final briefing to incoming instructors at the Special Warfare School. "The jungle doesn't care about your equipment or your doctrine. It only respects soldiers who understand the environment and adapt their tactics accordingly." Captain Bell had returned to Australia in 1971 to establish similar training programs for Commonwealth forces, carrying with him insights gained from working with American soldiers under combat conditions. His influence extended beyond individual tactics to broader questions about how modern armies should prepare for conflicts in complex terrain against adaptive enemies. The collaboration between Australian and American forces had created tactical innovations that neither military could have developed independently. The legacy extended far beyond Vietnam, as American special operations units incorporated jungle warfare techniques into training programs designed for global deployment. The Ranger School at Fort Benning added extended jungle warfare phases that replicated conditions encountered in Southeast Asia. The Special Forces Qualification Course expanded its survival training to include techniques originally developed by Australian SAS instructors working with MACV SOG units. General William Westmoreland, in his final assessment of American performance in Vietnam, acknowledged the strategic value of unconventional warfare techniques while maintaining his conviction that conventional operations remained decisive in large-scale conflicts. His report noted that special operations units had consistently outperformed expectations, but emphasized that their success depended on integration with conventional forces rather than replacement of traditional military capabilities. Small unit tactics proved invaluable for intelligence gathering and psychological operations, Westmoreland wrote in his official assessment. However, victory in modern warfare ultimately depends on the ability to mass forces and apply overwhelming firepower at decisive points. The jungle warfare techniques developed in Vietnam represent important additions to military capabilities rather than fundamental changes in strategic doctrine. O'Neill disagreed with Westmoreland's assessment but understood the institutional pressures that shaped such conclusions. The American military establishment had invested decades developing doctrine based on technological superiority and overwhelming force projection. Acknowledging that Australian methods represented fundamental improvements rather than specialized techniques would require admitting that basic assumptions about modern warfare needed revision. The practical impact was undeniable, regardless of theoretical debates. By 1975, every major American special operations unit had incorporated recondo training methods into standard curricula. Techniques that Captain Bell had taught to skeptical American students were now considered essential skills for soldiers deploying to jungle environments anywhere in the world. The influence extended to equipment development as American manufacturers began producing gear specifically designed for extended operations in tropical conditions. Lightweight fabrics replaced heavy cotton uniforms that retained moisture and created noise during movement. Weapon systems were modified to function reliably in high-humidity environments that caused conventional equipment to malfunction. Communication systems incorporated frequency-hopping technologies that prevented enemy interception of radio transmissions. Hudson's post-war career exemplified the institutional changes that Australian influence had created within American special operations. His expertise in jungle warfare tactics led to assignments in Central America during the 1980s, where insurgency conflicts required many of the same skills developed in Vietnam. The ability to operate independently in hostile terrain while gathering intelligence about enemy capabilities proved as valuable in El Salvador and Nicaragua as it had in Southeast Asia. The training programs established at Nui Dat continued operating under South Vietnamese control until April 1975, when North Vietnamese forces overran the facility during their final offensive. Australian instructors had withdrawn 2 years earlier, but the curriculum they established influenced South Vietnamese special operations units until the war's conclusion. Many techniques developed through Australian-American collaboration were adopted by North Vietnamese forces who observed their effectiveness during combat operations. O'Neill's final assignment in Southeast Asia involved documenting lessons learned from 3 years of intensive jungle warfare operations. His comprehensive analysis identified tactical innovations that had emerged from combining Australian fieldcraft with American technological capabilities, creating hybrid approaches that maximize the advantages of both military traditions while compensating for their individual limitations. The report's most significant conclusion challenged fundamental assumptions about force structure and training that had shaped American military development since World War II. O'Neill argued that future conflicts would increasingly favor small, highly trained units capable of independent operation in complex terrain over large formations, dependent on technological superiority and logistical support. The Vietnam experience demonstrated that adaptive enemies could neutralize many conventional advantages while exploiting weaknesses in training and doctrine. The enemy we faced in Vietnam learned from every engagement and adapted their tactics accordingly, O'Neill wrote in his final assessment. Our initial superiority in firepower and technology meant nothing when they refused to fight the kind of war we were prepared for. Success required learning new skills and abandoning preconceptions about how modern warfare should be conducted. The transformation proved permanent, as subsequent American military operations incorporated lessons learned through Australian collaboration. Special operations forces deploying to Grenada, Panama, and the Persian Gulf carried equipment and employed tactics that reflected years of refinement based on Southeast Asian experience. The quiet professionals who emerged from Recondo training programs became the foundation for expanded special operations capabilities that would define American military effectiveness in the late 20th century. By 1975, the skepticism that had initially greeted Australian SAS methods had been replaced by institutional recognition that jungle warfare expertise represented essential capabilities for modern military forces. The techniques that Captain Bell had patiently taught to reluctant American students were now considered fundamental skills that every special operations soldier needed to master. The transformation from conventional tactics to specialized techniques reflected broader changes in how the American military understood its role in an increasingly complex world. The legacy of Australian influence on American jungle warfare doctrine extended far beyond the Vietnam conflict, shaping special operations training and equipment development for decades. The lessons learned through collaboration between two military traditions created tactical innovations that proved adaptable to diverse environments and conflicts throughout the world. The jungle warfare expertise that emerged from this partnership became a permanent component of American military capabilities, ensuring that future generations of soldiers would benefit from hard-won experience in the green hell of Southeast Asia.